The town of San Dismas had not changed in nearly 15 years. Its streets still bled rust-colored dust, and its wind still carried the scent of sun-scorched pine, sweat, and distant blood. Some towns forgot their violence over time. San Dismas wore it like a second skin. At its center stood the chapel, long since converted into a courthouse, jailhouse, and auction block in one. The bell no longer rang for sermons, but for sentences. It was there that Jonas Maddox first heard her name, long before he saw her face. Jonas had come back to town for what he always said was the last time. The narrow pass from his mesa to the town's southern edge had grown more treacherous with each season. Not because of weather, but because of what waited at the end of the road. Memory, reckoning, and the unspoken weight of a life lived too long in, the gray between justice and guilt. He'd once been a lawman, not the kind who chased outlaws with posters and bravado, but the kind who signed orders behind closed doors. Quiet, efficient, final. A marshal without a badge, working not for townsfolk, but for the Bureau of Ecclesiastical Order, a forgotten branch of power that blurred scripture with statute and let God-fearing men burn down entire families in the name of obedience. 7 years ago, Jonas disappeared. Officially, he was declared dead after a failed operation on the southern frontier, where a woman and 4 children had vanished during a raid he authorized. Unofficially, he walked into the mountains with a gun, a bottle, and the ghost of that woman's scream lodged behind his ribs. He found solitude in a high valley past the Devil's Spine, a place even the hawks avoided, where he built a home out of cut stone and willful forgetting. His only visitors were storms and his own breathing. His left hand bore the scar of a noose, half-healed and hidden under leather, the result of a rebellion from within. When he'd tried to expose the trade in branded wives among church elders, they had turned on him faster than the mob ever could. They didn't hang him proper, just enough to silence him, enough to remind him that men like him were never saviors, only tools. Now, as he rode into San Dismas, dust caked to his boots and coat, the townsfolk barely looked his way. He'd grown leaner, more ghost than man, and no one remembered what he used to be, just that he didn't talk, didn't tip his hat, and always left before sundown. But that day was different. The square was filled, not with wagons or merchants, but with rows of benches, all facing a raised platform draped in crimson cloth. The bell had rung at noon, not for a sermon, but for something the townspeople now called the marking ceremony. It was a ritual not born of law, but of fevered righteousness. Any woman deemed disobedient, treacherous, or unclaimed could be branded by decree, property of the church, of the council, of her husband. Some were labeled R for runaway, others S for silence breakers. Some bore the mark of P, property, an old scar shaped like a circle with a line through it, pressed into their skin with an iron pulled from fire and shame. It was meant to deter, to purify. In truth, it only made the crowd hungrier. Jonas found himself standing at the edge of that square, hands folded, coat still fastened despite the heat, watching a scene unfold that felt too familiar to be chance. A young woman, bound at the wrists, dirt streaked across her face, blood crusted along her temple, stood on the platform surrounded by elders cloaked in ceremonial gray. She wore a torn linen dress, its collar pulled wide to expose the shoulder. Her mouth was bruised but not silenced. And when they read her name aloud, Sariah Boone, Jonas felt something twist behind his sternum. He knew the name, not from paper, from memory. Her sister, Miriam Boone, had been the woman from the southern raid, the one who died screaming for her daughters, for mercy, for fire to take her instead. Jonas had never known whether she survived. Now he knew. At least one had. And here she was, standing where her sister had died, staring at the crowd with the kind of eyes that made men remember what they'd tried to forget. The preacher in charge, a gaunt man with a voice like flint, declared her guilty of 4 charges: fleeing sanctuary, spreading false scripture, refusing marital claim, and vocal rebellion. Each, on its own, punishable by lashing or confinement. Together, they earn the mark. She has refused correction. She has refused placement. Therefore, she is no longer a woman. She is designation, branded for her own soul's recovery. The crowd murmured its approval, though a few faces, mostly older, mostly tired, looked away. As the brand was pulled from the coals, glowing red, Jonas felt a familiar tightening in his throat. Not anger, not pity. Something colder. Recognition. He stepped forward, boots striking the boards of the platform as if summoned by fate or fury. The guards turned, hands on rifles. But Jonas didn't flinch. He reached into his coat, pulled out a velvet pouch, and threw it at the preacher's feet. The coins spilled like dried blood, dull and heavy. Silver, not for purchasing, but for ransom. "Let her go," he said, his voice low and graveled from disuse. "She's no longer your concern." There was silence, the kind that hollows out the ribs. Then a laugh, sharp and brittle, from the preacher. "You think silver buys salvation, stranger?" Jonas looked him dead in the eye. "No, but it buys silence, and I know exactly how loud yours can get." The preacher hesitated. He recognized him, even through the beard and time. Maddox, the man who disappeared, the one who burned their orders and vanished into the rocks, the one who'd seen too much. Without waiting for consent, Jonas drew his blade, cut Sariah's bonds, and pulled her down from the post. She stumbled, but didn't fall. She didn't look at him, didn't ask why. Her face remained fixed forward, as if the branding had already happened in her mind and she was now somewhere else. As they turned to leave, the crowd parted, partly from fear, partly from shame. Outside town, at the edge of the ravine, they mounted his horse together. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't offer it. The sun was dropping behind the spines of the canyon, and in its final light, her skin seemed made of raw copper and defiance. He felt her weight behind him. Not fragile, not trusting, just there. Her fingers didn't grip him. She held the saddle, not the man. And when he looked back once, briefly, she said one thing, her voice cracked but steady. "You should have let them finish." He didn't answer, but he rode faster. The wind was already shifting by the time they crossed the river bend into the lower ridge trails, carrying with it the metallic scent of an oncoming storm, and the faint, slow echo of hoofbeats left behind. The silence between them wasn't companionable. It was the kind of silence that grows heavy, alive with the things neither could ask yet, because too many truths still hung in the space between. He didn't offer her food, nor water, nor comfort. She didn't ask. Her posture in the saddle behind him remained upright, too still for exhaustion, too poised for surrender. She was waiting. For what? Jonas wasn't sure yet. But it wasn't safety. She didn't ride like someone saved. When they reached the cabin, the dusk was already folding across the valley like a shadow laying claim. Jonas dismounted first, not looking back to see if she would follow. He wasn't entirely sure what he expected. Panic, collapse, maybe even retaliation. But when he turned, she was already sliding off the horse with a practiced swing, her feet landing firm despite the visible tremble in her legs. She took 2 steps toward the porch and then stopped, eyeing the structure with a look that wasn't fear, but calculation, as though she were measuring escape routes, weight-bearing beams, distance from the nearest tree line. Inside, the cabin was sparse but built like a bunker. Thick stone walls, reinforced doors, no windows on the north side. He moved to light the lantern, but she was already peeling off the blood-crusted remains of her outer wrap, revealing the raw, blistered edge of the half-branded letter on her shoulder. Jonas paused, the match burning down to his fingers before he dropped it. She didn't flinch, didn't hiss. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes over her shoulder. "If you have a needle, I'll need it boiled." He nodded once, not because he agreed, but because her tone didn't allow for refusal. She walked past him toward the wash basin, her steps clean, measured, like a woman who'd grown used to walking in pain and refused to limp for anyone anymore. While the water heated over the fire, Jonas set out his supplies, bandages, salves, the small bone-handled knife he used when stitching wounds deeper than what whiskey could numb. She sat on the edge of the table, unfastened the torn strap at her shoulder, and without ceremony exposed the full wound. It was worse up close. Blistered, charred flesh where the brand had been pressed in but not completed. The C had been half-formed, a crude curve scorched into skin too thin to bear that much heat without scarring deep. He worked in silence, cleaning, cutting away the dead tissue, stitching where it gaped. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't make a sound, didn't bite down on leather or drink from the flask he offered. Only once, when the blade hit live nerve near her clavicle, did her hand shoot out to grip the edge of the table. Her fingers found the groove in the wood, dug in as if claiming ownership of pain itself. "I watched them brand a child once," she said quietly as he worked. "She was 8. Didn't cry either. That scared them more than anything." Jonas didn't reply. He didn't need to. The only answer was the rhythm of the thread pulling through skin and the scent of scorched antiseptic. When it was done, he wrapped the shoulder in clean linen and turned away, expecting her to retreat into the dark corner like every other broken soul he'd ever dragged from a fire. Instead, she remained where she was, bare-shouldered and upright, her eyes locked on him with a stillness that demanded something more than sympathy. "You think saving me absolves you?" she asked. He blinked, taken off guard not by the question but by how precisely it struck. His mouth opened, then closed. Finally, he said, "No." "Good," she said, "because I don't forgive." The fire popped between them. Somewhere outside, coyotes began their long, mournful call. Jonas moved toward the stove, poured water into 2 metal cups, and slid one across the table toward her. She didn't touch it. Instead, she reached into the bundle of rags that had been her satchel and pulled out a small, bound notebook. Worn leather, frayed binding, the kind field medics used or rebels carried in their boots. She opened it to a page in the middle, then turned the book toward him. There, written in slanted, careful script, was a name. Miriam Boone, and beneath it, 4 more. Avery, Lisbeth, Ruth, Samuel. He stared at the page like it might change. Like if he just focused hard enough, the ink would rearrange itself into something easier. But it didn't. These were the names from the mission gone wrong. The one that broke everything. The woman who had died in the flames, Miriam. the children who had vanished. He'd never known if they'd escaped or perished. He looked up at Soraya, suddenly understanding more than he wanted to. "You were there," he said, voice hoarse. "No," she said. "I was late. I was the one they were waiting for. I brought the maps, the exit plan. They didn't make it." Jonas's throat clenched. He remembered the fire, the smell, the way the commanders had rushed the job, ordered the strike without confirming the target. He'd protested, been overruled, and then it was too late. "I was the reason they stayed in that house an extra night," she said, each word like a shard of glass placed on the table between them. "I was the reason she died with her arms over them." He sat back, felt the wind sucked from his chest. Soraya turned the page. Another list, this one longer. All women, all names he recognized in pieces, cases he'd touched, files he'd seen, all presumed dead, all erased under some righteous decree. She had documented them all. "You kept records?" he asked. "No, I kept truth. There's a difference." He didn't respond. He couldn't. Then, suddenly, she stood, stepped close, and before he could rise or react, she grabbed the collar of his shirt and yanked it down. Her fingers brushed the scar on his neck, the one hidden beneath layers of denial and stitched pride. The old noose burn, a mark not of martyrdom, but of failure. "They tried to hang you," she said. He nodded slowly. "But not for the things you did, for the things you saw." Another nod. "I don't need a savior," she said, "but I will use your silence and your name." "What does that mean?" She stepped back, walked toward the door, paused, hand on the frame. "It means you're not done paying, and neither am I." And then she vanished into the night. Dawn did not so much rise in the valley as seep through it, slow and reluctant, like warmth returning to a long-dead limb. The air still smelled faintly of char and blood, and the wind, though softer than it had been the night before, moved with a low whisper that made even the trees seem hesitant. Jonas stood on the porch, one hand resting on the rifle leaning against the wall, the other wrapped loosely around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. He hadn't slept. Sleep required a stillness inside he hadn't known in years, and after the night with Soraya Boone, it was clear that stillness had been replaced with something else entirely, unspoken, heavy, and alive. He'd expected her to be gone by morning. It was what any sane person would have done. Take advantage of a weakened man, a ride into the wilderness, a few supplies, and vanish into the hills to become another ghost in a region already full of them. Instead, when he opened the cabin door just before dawn, she was sitting at the small wooden table, bandaged shoulder bare, back to him, calmly rifling through the pile of maps he kept tucked beneath the false floorboard beneath the stove. He didn't ask how she found them. She didn't explain. She simply looked up as he entered, nodded toward the maps, and said, "Your trail markings are 6 years out of date. The North Pass collapsed in the spring of '73. You'll need to go around Raven's Cut if you want to get anything westbound through." It wasn't a challenge, not quite, more like a statement of intent, that she wasn't leaving, and, more importantly, that she was going to make herself useful whether he agreed to it or not. He studied her for a long moment, noting the way her left hand still trembled when she reached for the next parchment, the subtle wince when her shoulder tensed. She was still in pain, still recovering, but she was already calculating routes, escape vectors, supply runs. It wasn't survival instinct. It was planning. It was a soldier's mind inside the body of someone the world had branded a liability. He poured fresh coffee, set it down without a word, and began unpacking the crates he'd brought back from town. Salt, rope, copper wire, a new oil lamp. As he worked, she began to speak again, this time about weather patterns, animal migrations, even the fire trails she'd once mapped for a failed rebellion in the Southern Territories. It wasn't small talk. It was strategic, deliberate. She was, in essence, offering her services. But not for him. For something else. Something she hadn't named yet, and maybe couldn't. He let her speak. Let her move freely around the cabin, watching carefully as she adjusted the broken latch on the storage chest, checked the hinges on the back door, inspected the barrels of rainwater for contamination. She was testing the place, reinforcing it, not like someone seeking refuge, but like someone preparing for siege. It was midday before the confrontation happened. Jonas had stepped out to repair the fencing by the southern edge of the goat field, hammering rusted nails into warped wood when he heard it, the sharp metallic sound of his work drawer being opened. He turned just in time to see her slipping the revolver into her waistband, her hand calm, face unreadable. She didn't try to hide it. When he approached, she looked at him squarely and said, "Your enemies are old. Mine are persistent. I'd rather not die empty-handed." He didn't argue. He didn't need to. But he reached past her, took the second revolver from the same drawer, checked the chamber, and handed it to her with 3 bullets. "That one sticks on the draw," he said. "This one's clean." She accepted it with a nod, slid the weapon into her belt, and returned to the chair as if nothing had passed between them. But something had. That evening, as the shadows lengthened across the valley and the wind began to climb the canyon walls, they sat outside by the fire pit. She sharpening a broken blade with a river stone. He stringing wire across the porch rafters, listening for the telltale click of traps long buried in memory. And then, without turning, she said, "Do you know what they branded me for the first time?" He didn't answer. She continued anyway. "Disruption. That's what the mark meant. I was 14. I asked why the hymn about obedience never mentioned women by name. They said my question threatened the moral fabric of our community. So they burned a D into my thigh. Disruption." Jonas exhaled slowly. There was no response to that which didn't sound like apology, and apologies, in his experience, were the least effective form of penance. She stood then, stretched her arms slowly overhead, then turned toward the trailhead beyond the fence. "Someone's coming," she said. He frowned, rising. "You see them?" "No," she said, tapping her fingers against her sternum. "But I feel the change in the wind." 15 minutes later, the dust rose just beyond the ridge. 3 riders. Jonas recognized one instantly. Elias Reardon, former circuit judge turned bounty handler. The others were new, young, armed, overconfident. He walked out to meet them halfway down the slope, rifle across his back, revolver holstered but unlatched. "Jonas," Reardon said with a smile as sour as old vinegar, "heard rumors you weren't as dead as the records claim. Guess I forgot to sign the certificate." Reardon chuckled, then tipped his hat toward the cabin. "We're looking for a woman. Fugitive from San Dismas. Multiple charges. Name of Boone." "Lots of Boones in the registry," Jonas replied. "You'll need to be more specific." One of the younger riders stepped forward, cocky. "We can just check the place ourselves." Before Jonas could reply, the sharp retort of a rifle cracked from the cabin's roof. A bullet slammed into the dirt 3 feet from the led horse's hoof. The animal reared. The rider cursed. Jonas didn't move. "She's been watching your approach since you crossed the gulch," he said. "She's already dialed in your distance. Next shot won't miss." Reardon didn't blink, but he did rein his horse back half a step. "This ain't over," he said. "It is for tonight," Jonas replied. They rode off, slower than they'd come. Back at the cabin, Soraya sat cross-legged on the roof's edge, rifle resting across her lap, eyes following the retreating silhouettes like a hawk tracking a dying rabbit. When he climbed up beside her, she didn't look at him, just said, "Next time, we won't get a warning." He nodded. "Then we won't wait." They sat like that for a long time, the stars breaking through one by one, the cold wrapping around them like old history. And though no one said it out loud, the truth settled between them. They were no longer guest and host. They were now something else. Bound not by trust, but by mutual threat, and shared blood ahead. The heat broke 3 days later, not with rain, but with silence, a thick, unmoving stillness that fell over the valley like the hush before a confession. The animals moved slower, shadows deepened earlier, and even the wind, once a constant companion in the high ridges, seemed to hold its breath. It was on the 4th morning of that stilled air that Jonas found her gone. The cot where she'd slept was neatly made, her boots missing, and her coat, his, really, gone from the hook by the door. He felt no panic. If she'd wanted to run, she'd have done it before. This was something else, something quiet and purposeful. He saddled his mare, took only water and the knife from under the floorboard, and followed the tracks through the pine needles like reading a language he hadn't used in years. He found her at the edge of the ridge, kneeling beside a broken tree split clean through by old lightning. She was motionless, hands pressed flat against the earth, her forehead lowered like someone in prayer or surrender. He didn't speak, just stood back and watched as her shoulders moved with slow, rhythmic breath. Then she rose, dusted off her palms, and turned to him. There was no surprise in her face, only resolve. "It's coming," she said simply. He nodded once, not asking what she meant. He trusted her sense of things more than the sky. She walked past him down the trail and said nothing until they were back within sight of the cabin. "I need to show you something." In the low light of the bunkhouse, once his father's storeroom, now hollowed of meaning, she rolled up the boards under the hearth and pulled out a satchel wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were papers, thick with dust and time, maps, coordinates, copies of shipping manifests, a journal scrawled in 3 languages. Jonas recognized some of the markings. Locations he had once cleared, claimed, burned. Others were new, not military, medical, migration records, refugee caches. One name appeared more than once. Ruth Calder, a woman he'd been told had drowned in a river crossing a decade earlier. Apparently, she hadn't. Apparently, Soraya had helped her cross into the Whaling Pass and disappear. "These women," Soraya said, her voice low but anchored, "were taken, marked, erased. I started cataloging them when I was 17. We called them uncounted." She flipped a page, showed him a diagram of one of the branding irons. "They change the symbols every few years, rotate the letters, keep the public confused. But it's all the same system. Classification, devaluation, control." He looked at her, not the papers, not the names, but her, and saw what he'd missed beneath all her fire. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a cartographer of absence, of all the people this land had tried to forget. You built this while they hunted you? She nodded. Truth moves quieter than justice. Jonas sat, back against the wall, and for the first time in years pulled out the faded, dog-eared warrant that had ended his career. The order to purge a community south of the Drywell River. He unfolded it slowly, laid it beside her maps. She studied it a moment, then looked at him with something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't condemnation either. You knew, she said. I suspected. I followed orders. Then I stopped. That doesn't make you clean. I don't expect to be. A long pause stretched between them, the kind that usually ends in someone walking away. But instead, she reached for the brand chart and slid it toward him. You carried the G mark on your shoulder. Governance. I read about those men. Faceless enforcers. But no one ever said what it cost them. Jonas traced the letter with one finger, the old scar itching under his shirt like it always did when the past breathed too close. It cost everything. I just didn't realize how little that was. They sat that way until the light outside turned cold, until the shadows from the ridge stretched long across the cabin floor like hands reaching for something lost. That night, the storm came. Not lightning or thunder. A real storm, boots, hooves, wheels, a caravan of wagons cloaked in canvas marked with church sigils pulled into the lower ridge. Jonas counted at least 15 men, more than half-armed. They didn't approach immediately, just camped, as if by coincidence, 100 yards from the edge of the valley. Soraya watched them from the roof, lying flat on her stomach, her rifle aimed not with intent, but readiness. They'll wait until dawn, she said. They want to make a lesson out of it. Jonas stood below, watching the firelight from the caravan flicker like a memory he couldn't stamp out. They came for me once, years back, he said. Didn't finish the job. They're not here for you this time, she replied. No, he said. They're here for us. For the first time, she looked down at him, not with suspicion or calculation, but something quieter, acknowledgement, that whatever line had once divided them was gone. Not ally, not lover, something more dangerous. Witnesses to each other's truths, and that, in a place like this, was the only unforgivable crime. Dawn came like a knife sliding under the ribs of the valley, too bright, too fast, and without warning. The sky was stained the color of copper blood, and the scent of horses and cold iron clung to the air like a memory you couldn't scrub clean. Jonas watched them from the edge of the tree line, men moving with the discipline of trained dogs, not soldiers, but worse, ex-lawmen, branded mercenaries hired by ecclesiastical registrars to do the dirty work that bureaucrats no longer wanted to be. Associated with, these weren't zealots. They were professionals who had once worn badges and now wore faith like a coin purse, killing for whichever bishop paid most to keep silence. At the center of the caravan was a covered wagon larger than the rest, its canvas reinforced with blackened timber and marked with the double-ring insignia of the Council of Regional Order, the old CRO. That insignia hadn't been seen in these parts since Jonas burned his commission and walked into the Badlands. Its return meant only one thing. This wasn't about one woman anymore. It was about legacy, about unfinished reckonings, and about silencing the last man alive who knew how the entire system had once operated. Him. Inside the cabin, Soraya was already gathering the archive, maps, records, sketches, and names. So many names they barely fit in the satchel. Her hands moved quickly, not frantically, and her mouth was set in a line that told him she wasn't running. She was archiving not for preservation, but for dispersal. She had prepared for this moment in more ways than he had. It was a calculated evacuation, not of body but of truth. She'd made copies, sent letters, coded dispatches to other outposts he hadn't even known existed. If they came for her today, they wouldn't find a secret to bury. They'd find a fire already lit under the floorboards of the world they had tried to control. "They won't knock," she said simply, stuffing the last folder into the false panel beneath the bed. "They'll burn the place down and sift the ashes." Jonas nodded, stepping out onto the porch and watching the smoke from the caravan's cook fire rise in steady columns. "They've brought Judge Mercer," he said. "I thought he was dead." She paused, then said, "So did I. Last I heard he was reassigned to a Western rehabilitation post. Apparently, he's been reactivated." Jonas glanced back at her, "Which means they got desperate." "Or scared," she corrected. Mid-morning, a rider approached under flag. Young, barely 25, wearing the uniform of the Order's auxiliary arm, black vest, white cross stitched over the heart, pistol holstered but his right hand twitching near it as he rode. He stopped 10 feet from the gate and raised a sealed letter. "This is a lawful summons," he said, too loudly. "By decree of the Council and the Office of Ecclesiastical Custody, all unregistered females currently residing on this property must submit to immediate inspection and potential reclamation." Jonas didn't move. "And if they don't?" he asked. The rider hesitated. "Then we have jurisdiction to initiate forced extraction under Compliance Clause 78. Which means we take her by force or shoot anyone who interferes." The boy didn't look like he believed his own words. He was sweating under his collar, and his horse pawed the dirt nervously, as if it, too, sensed how close the tension sat to the surface. Jonas walked forward, took the letter, read 3 lines, then spat into the dirt. "There is no Clause 78, he said calmly. "That was struck down in the Treaty of Bandon Cross 10 years ago." The rider's face flushed. "I just follow the writ." "Then ride back and tell your master he's working off bad scripture." He turned and walked back inside, letter still in hand. "They're bluffing," he said to Soraya. "Testing whether we'll blink." "Then we won't," she replied, already moving toward the cellar hatch. "We draw them in." "You sure?" "I was born in a pit like this," she said. "I know how to turn the walls inside out." The first wave came an hour later. 4 men, 2 on foot, 2 on horseback, using smoke as cover, trying to set the east shed alight. Jonas shot the first one through the thigh. Not fatal, but enough to drop him screaming into the dry brush. The others scattered, regrouped, didn't return immediately. They were cautious, well-trained, but they hadn't expected resistance from 2 people who looked more like ghosts than fighters. Soraya had climbed the rear water tower and rigged it with tin mirrors, bouncing sunlight into their path until they couldn't see where the fire began and where it ended. She poured lye into the drainage pipe to make the smoke sting their lungs. When they tried to come through the creek, she'd already soaked the bank in lamp oil. 1 spark, and it became a wall of flame. By nightfall, they had counted 7 attempts, 2 injuries on the opposing side, no return fire yet. They were still trying to force surrender without casualties, a strategy Jonas knew wouldn't last. The CRO wanted public discipline, Blood made paperwork harder. But fear? Fear was clean. After dark, the judge finally spoke, a booming voice from the field, amplified by an old preacher's horn. "Jonas Maddox, you are harboring a marked defector. This is not redemption. This is rebellion. You, of all people, know the price of treason." Jonas stood just outside the firelight, staring into the night. "And you," Mercer continued, "Sariah Boone, you were granted mercy once. Now you answer for the lives you stole, the documents you forged, the oaths you broke. You're not a woman. You're a warning." Sariah laughed, short, humorless. "They've been calling me that since I could read." "They want you to surrender," Jonas said. "That won't happen. Then we escalate. They're already planning to. Good. Let them make the mistake." At dawn, they came again. 10 men, this time, full formation. 2 carrying torches, 2 with flintlock grenades, and the rest with chain cuffs swinging like bells. Sariah stood in the open yard, unarmed, hands raised. They paused, confused. Jonas moved silently along the roof, rifle steady. When the man with the torch stepped forward, Sariah dropped to the dirt, and Jonas fired. 1 shot, 2, 3, each finding muscle, not bone, disabling without killing. Chaos erupted. The squad scattered, and, in the confusion, Jonas shouted, "Now!" From the woods, 4 figures emerged. Refugees, women Sariah had helped smuggle out weeks ago. They carried rocks, clubs, old axes. They weren't soldiers, but they were angry, and that was enough. The order's line broke. The caravan pulled back, this time with urgency. Mercer did not shout again. Later, Sariah and Jonas stood beside the burnt remains of the east fence. He turned to her and said, "You know they'll send more. Real soldiers next time." She nodded. "Let them. I already mailed your name to 3 border stations. If I don't make it out of here, the story won't die with me. And what about you? I'm already a ghost. I just want the truth to have a grave with my name on it." Jonas didn't answer right away. He reached into the ashes, pulled out one of the old CRO badges and handed it to her. "Then let's give them a war they can't redact." And as night fell again over the valley, the fire behind them turned to smoke, and the bond between them hardened into something sharper than survival. The sun rose black behind the smoke. It wasn't fire this time, but soot. Heavy, deliberate, and industrial, rolling in over the ridge from the west like a warning laid in ash. Jonas had seen it once before, 15 years back on the border of Tucson Territory, when an outpost had been raised not by raiders or bandits, but by an internal purification squad sent by the council itself. It meant the CRO had stopped pretending. They no longer needed her alive. Her testimony, her archive, her body, it was all irrelevant now. The erasure had begun. They weren't coming to capture anymore. They were coming to consume. Sariah stood by the well, her hands black with ink and grease from the last of the archival canisters. She had sealed them into the stone casing 2 nights ago, and now worked to bury them beneath false rock and iron. The documents wouldn't save her life, but they would outlive her, and that was the only currency she still believed in. Jonas watched from the porch, rifle across his back, his old uniform jacket tied around his waist. He had unearthed it from the back of the storage chest, not for symbolism, but for recognition. If they wanted to erase him too, he'd make sure they knew exactly whose memory they were burning. The first strike came at mid-morning. A sonic wave, a pulse bomb, not common for this sector, struck the tree line and shattered every window in the cabin. Birds dropped from the sky. The animals screamed. Jonas tackled Soraya to the ground without thinking, shielding her body with his. For a few seconds they lay in the dirt, deafened, stunned. When she opened her eyes, she was bleeding from the temple. He touched the wound gently, then handed her the small, custom-forged revolver he'd kept hidden in the chimney since his first winter here. She took it without a word. The sky above them was turning gray-blue, not with weather but with the exhaust of low-hovering aircraft. Compact, silent, no flag, no registration. Private, not government, not church, contracted. Soraya stared at them with hollow fury. "They're subcontracting our erasure," she muttered. "Too much blood on the church's hands already. Now they pay others to stain theirs." Jonas didn't disagree. He had once signed contracts like that himself, operated under invisible flags, struck targets deemed symbolically dangerous. They always said the same thing before the end: erase the body and the myth dies. But it never really died. It scattered. That afternoon, the real siege began. They set fire to the surrounding brush, not to smoke them out, but to blind them. 24 men advanced in rotating teams, 6 at a time, from 3 angles, always shifting. Professional, trained. They avoided direct confrontation, choosing instead to pin Jonas and Soraya within the main cabin, slowly tightening the circle. The cabin itself had become a bunker, windows boarded, back door wired, roof rigged with pressure shards made from glass and rusted nails. Every hour brought a new hit, and every hit Jonas countered with old tricks, traps laid years ago and long forgotten until today. By nightfall, the cabin was half rubble. The roof had collapsed on the northern edge. The goat pen was gone, torched into black bones. The well had been sealed by an incendiary blast. Water was gone. Smoke filtered through the cracks in the floorboards, not from the fire but from smoldering debris stacked strategically to suffocate them. Soraya coughed blood but remained upright, still marking maps, recalculating escape vectors even as the walls burned around them. Jonas, dragging a ruined leg, finally collapsed beside the stone stove and said, "We won't make it to dawn." She looked at him, eyes glassy but focused. "Then we don't give them dawn." Outside, they could hear chanting, low, rhythmic, ritualistic. Not scripture, but doctrine. A death rite. Soraya laughed bitterly. They're absolving themselves in advance, like they always do. Jonas gritted his teeth against the pain in his ribs. "You ever think maybe we are damned?" She reached over, touched his bloodied shoulder, and said, "Only if we die quiet." In the final hour before midnight, they made their move, not to run, but to divide. Soraya opened the west hatch and vanished into the night with 3 flares and the last of the smoke bombs. Jonas took the eastern flank with nothing but his rifle, 2 rounds, and a belt of old grenades. The goal wasn't escape. It was fracture. It was memory. She set off the flares across the ridge in patterns, a code only survivors would recognize, marks that told any watchers, any children, any ghosts that the archive had not died. Jonas made it as far as the radio tower, barely 100 feet from the cabin before they hit him. A clean shot to the shoulder dropped him to the dirt. He rolled, took out 2 in return before the others descended. They didn't kill him. They dragged him, bloodied, battered, back to the smoldering cabin and threw him at the feet of Judge Mercer, who stood dressed in ceremonial black, face veiled, his voice like rot and gravel. "You were supposed to be legend," Mercer said. "Now look at you, just a man who forgot the price of obedience." Jonas, bleeding from the mouth, spat at the judge's feet. "If you're here, then she got out." Mercer smiled thinly. "She won't get far. We've burned every crossing for 30 miles. Even ghosts need breath." As he raised his hand to signal the final order, a sound split the darkness. Not gunfire, not explosion, but a scream. Not one of pain, one of fury, one of legacy. Then, through the trees, came fire. Not from matches or oil, but from the detonation of 3 powder kegs Jonas had buried when the cabin was first built, deep beneath the root cellar. The entire eastern wing of the land erupted in flame, consuming brush, crates, 3 of the CRO men, and the signal relay tower. Soraya, bloodied, limping, emerged from the inferno holding a flare in one hand and a broken axe in the other. "You forgot one thing, Mercer," she shouted, her voice hoarse but hard as iron. "I am the price." They fought like feral shadows. No choreography, no precision, just brute will. She reached him. He grabbed her by the throat. Jonas, on his knees, pulled the final grenade pin with his teeth. The explosion was small, tight, but enough to collapse the southern trench and trap Mercer's men beneath the rubble. When the dust settled, only Jonas and Soraya remained, broken, burned, alive. She crawled to him, pressed her hand to his bleeding chest. "I marked you once," she said. "Now I name you." He smiled through cracked lips. "Then say it." And in the silence that followed, she whispered not his rank, not his title, but his first name. Jonas. Then she carved her name into his belt. Boone. And he nodded. "Now I'm whole." It took 3 days for the smoke to clear, not from the hills or the trees, but from the minds of those who survived. The valley was hushed now, no longer under siege, but not untouched either. Charred timbers stood like ribs of a broken body, the stone chimney alone rising amid the ashes as if in defiance of erasure. Rain fell once, a short and bitter drizzle that did nothing to cleanse the ground but left muddy footprints deep enough to remember which way the survivors had gone. Jonas could no longer walk without leaning heavily on the carved cedar staff Soraya had fashioned from the remnants of the porch beam, and every breath he took was lined with rust and memory, but he was alive, stitched together with wire and resolve, moving as though his bones had forgotten how to break. Soraya bore her scars more quietly, though no less visibly, half her ribs bruised, 2 fingers twisted at the joint, and a welt at her temple that would never fully fade. But her eyes had changed the most. They no longer searched for escape, only witness. They didn't rebuild, not in the old way. The cabin's remains were dismantled carefully, stone by stone, until the valley was open again, exposed to sky and wind and whatever came next. In its place, they built something flatter, wider, part shelter, part passage. No doors, no locks, a fire pit at the center, always warm, and a ledge carved with initials that weren't theirs. Children came first. 2 girls with one-eyed dolls, and a boy who hadn't spoken since losing his sister to a branding station outside Pennant's Ridge. Then an older man who refused to say his name, but built wind chimes from broken metal and made the little ones laugh in the mornings. No one asked questions. They came, they stayed, or they didn't. But the map kept growing, etched into leather, then clay, then copper, passed from hand to hand like sacrament. The archive, once buried beneath the Boone house, was now scattered across 12 territories. Not one copy. Dozens. Some incomplete. Some forged anew from memory. It didn't matter. The truth, once loosed, was a contagion. Soraya kept writing. At night, under lamplight, in the quiet hour before dawn, she inked the names of the fallen into a ledger she bound with braided hair from the women who had died in the siege. She never raised a monument. She said the ground itself was grave enough. Jonas, for his part, tended the perimeter. He set traps still, out of habit, but never lethal. Warnings, not sentences. He trained the older boys to shoot, but only after they recited the code. Never first, never blind, never again. He wore her name on a patch over his shoulder now, not sewn, but branded into the leather. Boone, no rank, no initials, just that. When asked if they were husband and wife, neither answered, not because it wasn't true, but because the question had ceased to matter. Years passed that way, not marked by calendars but by migrations. A flood one spring destroyed the North Trail. A fever swept through 2 winters later and took the silent boy and the girl with the doll. Soraya dug their graves herself, and Jonas carved their names into the ledge with the same knife he'd once used to carve bullets. One day, a woman arrived carrying a child with Soraya's eyes. She said nothing, just sat by the fire and watched her sleep. The next morning, she was gone, but the child remained. They named her Ruth, not after the biblical one, but after the name scratched into the first archive. Ruth Calder, the one who lived when no one else did. When Jonas died, it was not in fire or battle or silence. It was in spring, in his chair beneath the aspen tree, with his boots on and his coat wrapped around Ruth's shoulders. He did not speak. He did not leave a letter, only a final mark carved into the wooden railing beside him. Her name, then his, then nothing. Soraya did not weep. She carried him herself to the ridge, laid him down where the wild goats once grazed, and covered him with stone, not for weight, but for memory. There is no headstone, only a leather strip nailed to the tree above the grave, faded now, bearing one phrase: named by her, remembered by none. It is enough.